The rain hammered against the barn roof as Peter Morrison stepped into the darkness, his flashlight cutting through shadows that seemed to move on their own. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. His prize bull, Thunder, hadn't returned with the herd 3 days ago, and now strange sounds echoed from the old storage shed his grandfather had sealed shut decades before. As Peter's trembling hand reached for the rusted padlock, a voice whispered from behind the wooden boards, "Please, don't lift the blanket." But Peter had already seen too much. What he discovered beneath that tattered wool covering would shatter everything he thought he knew about his family's land. His grandfather's secrets, and the true reason why no one in Millbrook County had spoken his family name in over 40 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Peter Morrison had always believed that running a cattle ranch meant dealing with predictable problems. Sick animals, broken fences, equipment failures, unpredictable weather. After inheriting the sprawling 2,400-acre Morrison Ranch in eastern Colorado from his father 5 years ago, he'd learned to handle most crises with the steady pragmatism that had kept his family's operation profitable for 3 generations, but nothing had prepared him for this. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in late October, when his prize Angus bull, Thunder, failed to return with the rest of the herd from the north pasture. Thunder was worth $40,000 and had sired some of the finest calves Peter had ever raised. More importantly, the massive black bull had never strayed from the herd in his 6 years on the ranch. Thunder was as reliable as sunrise, always leading the cattle back to the main compound at feeding time. Peter spent that entire day searching every acre of the north section, riding his ATV through ravines and checking every waterhole and salt lick. His ranch hands, Miguel Santos and Jake Brennan, covered the eastern boundaries, while Peter scoured the rocky terrain near Widow's Creek. By sunset, they'd found nothing except Thunder's hoofprints leading toward a section of the property that Peter rarely visited. The old Morrison homestead sat in a remote corner of the ranch, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through dense stands of cottonwood and scrub oak. Peter's great-grandfather, Ezekiel Morrison, had built the original farmhouse there in 1923, but the family had abandoned it in the 1960s when Peter's grandfather, Clayton Morrison, moved everyone to the modern ranch house closer to town. The old buildings had been left to decay, slowly surrendering to weather and time. Peter hadn't been to the homestead in over 2 years. There was nothing there worth maintaining. Just the crumbling remains of the original house, a collapsed chicken coop, and an old storage shed that Clayton had sealed with heavy chains and multiple padlocks sometime in the late 1960s. As a child, Peter had asked his grandfather what was inside the shed, but Clayton had always changed the subject or sent him away to do chores. Eventually, Peter stopped asking. Following Thunder's trail, Peter found himself approaching the homestead as darkness fell. His flashlight beams swept across the weathered buildings, casting long shadows that seemed to dance in the wind. The hoofprints led directly to the storage shed, then simply vanished. It was as if Thunder had walked up to the building and disappeared. Peter circled the shed 3 times, searching for any sign of where Thunder might have gone. The structure was roughly 20 feet square, built from thick timber planks that had turned gray with age. The roof showed signs of recent repair, which struck Peter as odd, since no one had maintained these buildings in decades. Fresh lumber strips covered several gaps in the planking, and new nails gleamed silver against the weathered wood. More puzzling were the chains. Peter remembered them being old and rusty, but now heavy-duty steel chains secured the door with 3 modern padlocks. Someone had recently reinforced the shed's security, but who and why? As Peter examined the locks more closely, he heard something that made his blood freeze. From inside the shed came a low, mournful sound. Not quite a moan, not quite a cry, but something deeply human and filled with unbearable sadness. The sound lasted only a few seconds before fading to silence, but Peter knew he hadn't imagined it. "Hello?" he called out, pressing his ear against the wooden door. "Is someone in there?" No response. Peter knocked on the door. "This is Peter Morrison. If someone's in there, please answer me." Still nothing. He tried calling Thunder's name, thinking perhaps the bull was trapped inside. But the shed was far too small to contain an animal of Thunder's size. Besides, the sound he'd heard hadn't come from any animal. It was distinctly human, filled with a kind of anguish that spoke of consciousness, of awareness, of suffering that went beyond physical pain. Peter spent the next hour walking the perimeter of the homestead, searching for any other clues about Thunder's disappearance. He found disturbed earth near the old well, patches of ground that looked freshly turned despite the recent dry spell. Tire tracks led from the main road to the homestead, but they were too faded to determine when they'd been made. As he prepared to leave, Peter heard the sound again. This time it was clearer, more distinct. A voice, definitely human, calling out words he couldn't quite make out. The voice was weak, raspy, as if the speaker hadn't used it in a very long time. "Please," the voice whispered, barely audible through the wooden walls. "Please help me." Peter's heart hammered against his ribs. Someone was trapped in the shed, someone who needed help. But how had they gotten in? And who had the keys to those padlocks? He ran back to his ATV and drove to the main ranch house, his mind racing with possibilities. None of them made sense. The homestead was miles from any road that strangers would use. The only people who knew about it were Peter, his ranch hands, and perhaps some of the older locals who remembered when the Morrison family had lived there. But why would anyone be in the shed? And why had his grandfather sealed it so thoroughly? At the ranch house, Peter called Miguel and Jake, asking them to meet him at the homestead with bolt cutters and emergency medical supplies. He didn't explain what he'd heard, only that someone might be trapped in the old storage shed. Both men agreed to come immediately, their loyalty to Peter overriding any questions about the strange request. While waiting for his employees, Peter searched his father's papers for any mention of the old homestead or the storage shed. He found property surveys, tax records and maintenance logs going back decades, but nothing that explained why Clayton Morrison had sealed the building or what it might contain. In a box of his grandfather's personal effects, Peter discovered a leather-bound journal filled with Clayton's careful handwriting. Most entries dealt with ranch operations, weather reports, and cattle prices, but several pages had been torn out, leaving only ragged edges and fragments of words. The remaining entries from 1968 were particularly cryptic. "The voices have stopped. Thank God they've finally stopped. Ezekiel's sins aren't mine to bear, but the responsibility falls to me now. Some secrets should die with the men who create them. I've done what I can to ensure this one stays buried." Peter stared at these entries, trying to decode their meaning. What voices? What secrets? And what role had his great-grandfather Ezekiel played in whatever had happened at the homestead? Miguel and Jake arrived within the hour, their trucks loaded with tools and first-aid equipment. Both men were experienced ranch hands who'd worked for the Morrison family for years. But Peter could see concern in their eyes as they followed him through the darkness toward the abandoned buildings. "Boss, what exactly are we dealing with here?" Miguel asked as they parked near the storage shed. "You sounded pretty shook up on the phone." Peter explained about Thunder's disappearance and the voice he'd heard from inside the shed. Both men listened without interruption, their expressions growing more troubled with each detail. "Could someone hurt badly?" Jake suggested. "Maybe they crawled in there looking for shelter and got trapped when the door swung shut." "The door's chained and locked from the outside," Peter replied. "Multiple locks, all new." "Someone put those chains there recently," Miguel frowned. "Who else has access to this property?" "No one, as far as I know. That's what worries me." They approached the shed cautiously, Peter leading with his flashlight, while Miguel and Jake flanked him with their own lights. The building looked even more ominous in the darkness, its weathered walls seeming to absorb their flashlight beams rather than reflect them. Peter called out again, "Hello? We're here to help. Can you hear me?" This time the response came immediately. A voice, weak but clearly human, speaking words that chilled Peter to the bone. "Please, don't lift the blanket. Promise me you won't lift the blanket." The three men exchanged glances. What blanket? And why was the person inside so desperate that it remained undisturbed? "We're going to get you out of there," Peter called back. "Just stay calm. We have bolt cutters." "No!" The voice became urgent, almost panicked. "You don't understand. You can't see what's under there. Promise me. Please, promise you won't look." Miguel stepped closer to Peter. "Boss, this is getting weird. Maybe we should call the sheriff." Peter considered this. Sheriff Rebecca Walsh was competent and trustworthy, but she was also 30 miles away. If someone inside the shed was seriously injured, they might not have time to wait for official help. "We'll cut the locks and see what we're dealing with," Peter decided. "Then we'll call for backup if necessary." Jake positioned the bolt cutters on the first padlock, while Miguel and Peter held their flashlights steady. The metal parted with a sharp crack that echoed across the homestead. As Jake moved to the second lock, the voice from inside the shed became more agitated. "You're making a terrible mistake. You don't know what you're doing. The blanket must stay in place. My father made me promise. I've kept that promise for 50 years. 50 years? Peter's mind raced. If someone had been trapped in the shed for 50 years, they would be long dead. But the voice was definitely alive, definitely present. None of this made sense. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The second lock fell away, then the third. Jake began unwinding the heavy chains, while Peter and Miguel prepared for whatever they might find inside. Peter's hands shook slightly as he reached for the door handle. In all his years on the ranch, he'd never encountered anything that filled him with such dread. "Last chance," the voice whispered from within. "Please leave the door closed. Some things should stay buried." But Peter was already turning the handle. The door creaked open on rusted hinges, and their flashlight beams penetrated the interior of the storage shed for the first time in decades. What they found inside would haunt Peter Morrison for the rest of his life. The interior of the shed hit Peter like a physical blow. The stench came first, decades of human confinement mixed with something else, something organic and wrong. His flashlight beam revealed a space that had been converted into a makeshift prison cell sometime in the distant past. Iron bars divided the shed into two sections. The front area contained scattered tools, old farming equipment, and a wooden chair positioned to face the barred section. The back area behind the bars housed what could only be described as a crude living space. A mattress lay on the floor, surrounded by empty water jugs, tin plates, and waste buckets that explained part of the overwhelming smell. But it was the figure huddled in the corner that made Peter's breath catch in his throat. An elderly man, gaunt to the point of being skeletal, wrapped in filthy blankets and staring at them with wild, terrified eyes. His hair had grown white and reached nearly to his shoulders. His beard was equally long and unkempt. Most disturbing of all, his legs appeared to be shackled to the wall with heavy chains. "Dear God," Miguel whispered. Crossing himself, Jake stepped backward, bumping into Peter. "Boss, we need to call the sheriff right now." The old man raised a trembling hand toward them. "You shouldn't have come. I told you not to come." His voice was the same one they'd heard through the walls, but seeing him speak made it even more heartbreaking. "Now you'll want to lift the blanket, and I can't let that happen." Peter forced himself to step closer to the bars. "Sir, my name is Peter Morrison. This is my family's property. How long have you been here?" The man's laugh was bitter and broken. "Morrison. Of course you're a Morrison. I should have recognized the voice. You sound just like Clayton did when he was young." He struggled to sit up straighter. "I've been here since 1973, 52 years, 3 months, and 14 days. The number hit Peter like a sledgehammer. This man had been imprisoned in his family's storage shed for over 5 decades. "That's impossible. You'd be dead. Who's been taking care of you?" "Clayton visited every few days until he passed 5 years ago. Brought me food, water, books sometimes. Your father came twice after Clayton died, but he couldn't look me in the eye. Haven't seen anyone since then, until tonight. The old man's gaze darted nervously around the shed. But that doesn't matter now. What matters is that you leave this place and never come back. Lock the door, walk away, and forget you ever saw me. Miguel had been examining the setup more closely. Boss, look at this. He pointed to a complex pulley system that allowed food and water to be passed through the bars without opening the cell door. Someone spent a lot of time setting this up. This wasn't temporary. Peter's mind reeled with the implications. His grandfather had kept a man prisoner for decades. His father had known about it. And now Peter was faced with a family secret so dark and twisted that he could barely process it. "What's your name?" Peter asked the prisoner. The old man hesitated for a long moment. "Thomas Hartwell. Though I suppose that name doesn't mean much anymore." Hartwell. Peter knew that name from local history. The Hartwell family had been prominent in Millbrook County during the 1960s, owning several businesses and serving in local government. But they disappeared suddenly in the early 1970s, leaving behind empty houses and abandoned properties. The official story was that they'd moved to California, but no one had ever heard from them again. The Hartwell family owned the grain elevator, Peter said slowly, and the hardware store. "What happened to your family?" Thomas's face crumpled with grief. "Dead, all dead. Because of what I found. Because I threatened to expose what your great-grandfather was doing." He pulled his blankets tighter around himself. "Ezekiel Morrison was a monster, and when I tried to stop him, Clayton made sure I could never tell anyone." Jake was pacing near the door, clearly agitated. "This is insane. We need to get this man to a hospital and call the FBI. This is kidnapping, false imprisonment, probably a dozen federal crimes." "You don't understand," Thomas said urgently. "If you call the authorities, they'll investigate. They'll search this property, and eventually they'll want to know what's under the blanket." He pointed to a corner of his cell where a large, moth-eaten blanket covered something roughly the size of a human body. Peter followed Thomas's gaze to the blanket-covered shape. Even in the dim light, he could see that whatever lay beneath it was wrong somehow. The proportions weren't quite right, and there seemed to be too many angles, too many bulges where a human body should be smooth. "What's under there?" Peter asked, though part of him already feared the answer. "Something that should have been buried properly 50 years ago. Something that proves your great-grandfather was capable of things that would destroy your family's name forever." Thomas's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I've been guarding it all these years, making sure no one ever sees what Ezekiel Morrison did." Miguel approached Peter cautiously. "Boss, maybe we should respect his wishes. Cut his chains, get him medical attention, but leave whatever that is alone." But Peter was already moving toward the cell door, searching for a way to open the bars. "This man needs help immediately. We can sort out the rest later." "The key is in the toolbox," Thomas said reluctantly, pointing to a red metal toolbox on a shelf. "But please, I'm begging you, don't touch the blanket. Don't even look at it too closely. Some knowledge isn't meant to be shared." Peter found an old brass key in the toolbox and unlocked the cell door. The hinges screamed in protest as the bars swung open for the first time in decades. Thomas cowered as Peter approached, as if he'd forgotten how to interact with other human beings. "We're not going to hurt you," Peter said gently. "Let me see those chains." The shackles around Thomas's ankles were secured with modern padlocks, similar to the ones that had sealed the shed. Peter used the bolt cutters to free the old man's legs, revealing deep scars where the metal had chafed against his skin for decades. "Can you walk?" Peter asked. Thomas tried to stand, but immediately collapsed. His legs, weakened by 50 years of confinement, couldn't support his weight. Jake and Miguel helped him to the wooden chair, while Peter called 911 on his cell phone. "This is Peter Morrison at the old Morrison homestead on County Road 47. He told the dispatcher. "I need an ambulance immediately. I've found an elderly man who's been imprisoned here for decades. He needs emergency medical attention." While they waited for the ambulance, Peter tried to piece together Thomas's story. According to the old man, Ezekiel Morrison had been involved in something terrible in the late 1960s. Thomas, who'd been a young businessman at the time, had discovered evidence of Ezekiel's crimes and threatened to expose them to the authorities. "I was stupid and naive," Thomas said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "I thought I could reason with him, maybe convince him to turn himself in. Instead, I walked into a trap. Clayton was waiting for me when I arrived at the homestead. He knocked me unconscious, and when I woke up, I was in that cell. But why keep you alive?" Peter asked. "If my grandfather wanted to silence you, why not just kill me?" Thomas finished. "I asked myself that question every day for the first 10 years. Eventually, I realized the truth. Clayton wasn't just keeping me quiet about what Ezekiel had done. He was making sure I stayed here to guard the evidence." Peter glanced again at the blanket-covered shape in the corner. "What kind of evidence requires a human guard?" Thomas's eyes filled with tears. "The kind that gets up and walks around if you're not careful." The words sent a chill down Peter's spine. "What does that mean?" Before Thomas could answer, they heard sirens approaching. The ambulance had arrived, along with what sounded like several police cars. Peter stepped outside to guide them to the shed, leaving Miguel and Jake with Thomas. Sheriff Rebecca Walsh was the first to reach the building, followed by 2 paramedics and 3 deputies. Her expression grew increasingly grim as Peter explained the situation, though he left out the details about the blanket-covered shape in the corner. "How long has this man been imprisoned here?" she asked, shining her flashlight into the shed. "He claims it's been over 50 years. Since 1973, Sheriff Walsh whistled low. "That would make this one of the longest unlawful imprisonment cases in state history. We'll need to contact the FBI, the State Attorney General's office, probably the U.S. Attorney." She paused, studying Peter's face. "Did you know about this?" "I had no idea. I was looking for a missing bull and followed its tracks here. I heard voices from inside the shed and came back with help to investigate. The paramedics were already working on Thomas, checking his vital signs and preparing him for transport. Despite his ordeal, the old man seemed surprisingly alert and coherent. As they loaded him onto a stretcher, he grabbed Peter's arm with surprising strength. "Promise me," he whispered urgently. "Promise you won't let anyone lift that blanket until I can explain properly. There are things you need to understand first." "I promise," Peter said, though he wasn't sure why he was making such a commitment. Sheriff Walsh overheard the exchange. "What blanket is he talking about?" Peter led her into the shed and pointed to the covered shape in the corner of the cell. "He's been very insistent that we not disturb it. Claims it's evidence of something my great-grandfather did decades ago." The sheriff approached the blanket cautiously, pulling on latex gloves. "This looks like it could be human remains. We'll need to treat this as a potential crime scene." She turned to Peter. "I'm going to have to ask you and your men to step back while we secure the area." As the paramedics wheeled Thomas toward the ambulance, he called out one last time, "Remember your promise, Peter Morrison. Don't let them lift it until you know the whole truth. The truth about what happened to my family. The truth about what your great-grandfather really was." The ambulance drove away into the night, its red lights disappearing beyond the cottonwood trees. Sheriff Walsh began cordoning off the shed with crime scene tape, while her deputies started photographing everything in the cell. Peter stood in the darkness outside the shed, his mind struggling to process everything that had happened. His family had kept a man imprisoned for over 50 years. His grandfather and father had been complicit in one of the most heinous crimes imaginable. And somewhere under that moth-eaten blanket lay evidence of something even worse. As dawn began to break over the eastern horizon, Peter realized that his life would never be the same. Whatever secrets his family had buried at the old homestead were about to be exposed. And he wasn't sure he was ready for the truth, but Thomas Hartwell's words echoed in his mind. The truth about what your great-grandfather really was. What kind of man keeps another human being locked in a cage for 5 decades? And what could be so terrible that it required such extreme measures to keep it hidden? Peter was about to find out, and he suspected the answers would be more horrifying than anything he could imagine. The Morrison Ranch became a circus of law enforcement activity over the next 48 hours. FBI agents from Denver arrived in black SUVs, followed by forensic specialists, crime scene investigators, and what seemed like half the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. Peter watched from his kitchen window as they swarmed over the old homestead like ants, photographing everything, measuring distances, and carefully documenting 5 decades of imprisonment. But they still hadn't lifted the blanket. Sheriff Walsh had honored Peter's promise to Thomas Hartwell, at least temporarily. The blanket-covered shape remained undisturbed, while investigators focused on the imprisonment case itself. They'd found Thomas's fingerprints throughout the cell, along with evidence of the pulley system, the waste disposal arrangements, and decades of basic survival. DNA evidence confirmed that someone had indeed lived in that space for an extended period. Peter spent those 2 days fielding phone calls from reporters, FBI agents, and lawyers. The story had leaked to the media within hours, and news vans lined the road leading to his property. Headlines screamed across newspapers and websites. Colorado rancher discovers 50-year-old prisoner. Family secret exposed after 5 decades. The Morrison Ranch horror, but Peter's mind kept returning to Thomas's final words as the ambulance had driven away. The truth about what Ezekiel Morrison really was. What did that mean? And why was Thomas so terrified of what lay beneath that blanket? On Thursday morning, Peter received a call from Dr. Elizabeth Crane at Denver General Hospital, where Thomas had been taken for medical evaluation. "Mr. Morrison, I'm calling about Thomas Hartwell. He's been asking to speak with you specifically. His physical condition is remarkably good, considering his ordeal, but he's extremely agitated about something. He keeps insisting that you need to visit him before law enforcement examines what he calls the evidence." Peter drove to Denver that afternoon, his truck cutting through traffic as his mind raced with questions. The hospital was a maze of corridors and elevators, but he finally found Thomas in a private room on the 7th floor. The old man looked dramatically different, cleaned up and wearing a hospital gown. His hair had been trimmed, his beard shortened, and his face, while still gaunt, showed intelligence and determination that hadn't been visible in the darkness of the shed. "You came," Thomas said, relief evident in his voice. "I wasn't sure you would. I gave you my word." Peter pulled up a chair beside the bed. "The doctors say you're doing well. 50 years of captivity doesn't kill you as long as you have a reason to keep living." My reason was making sure nobody ever lifted that blanket. Thomas gripped the hospital bed's side rail. "But now that I'm free, that responsibility passes to you. I don't understand. What's so important about keeping it covered?" Thomas stared at the ceiling for a long moment before speaking. "Your great-grandfather Ezekiel Morrison wasn't just a rancher. During the late 1960s, he was involved with a group of men who believed they could communicate with the dead. They called themselves the Millbrook Circle." Peter frowned. "Like a seance group." "Much more than that. They thought they could bring people back. Not resurrect them exactly, but animate them, give them a kind of life." Thomas's voice dropped to a whisper. And they succeeded. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Peter felt a chill run down his spine, despite the hospital's warmth. "That's impossible," Peter said. "You're talking about necromancy, black magic. Call it whatever you want, but I saw the results with my own eyes." Thomas turned to face Peter directly. "In 1972, my younger brother David was killed in a car accident. He was only 19 years old. Our family was devastated, especially our mother. She'd heard rumors about Ezekiel and his group, whispers that they could bring back the dead for grieving families." Peter shook his head. "Thomas, grief can make people believe. My mother paid Ezekiel $5,000 to perform their ritual on David's body. And it worked." Thomas's eyes filled with tears. 3 days after the funeral, David walked into our house. He spoke to us. He remembered us. But he wasn't right." "What do you mean?" "He was cold all the time, even in summer. His skin had a gray tint that makeup couldn't hide. He moved differently, like his joints didn't work properly. And his eyes," Thomas shuddered. "His eyes were completely black. Not dark brown, not dilated pupils. Black as coal, like looking into an empty well. Peter felt his rational mind rebelling against these words. But Thomas spoke with such conviction, such painful honesty, that doubt began creeping in. David lived with us for 6 months, Thomas continued. Our mother was ecstatic at first. She had her baby boy back. But gradually, we realized that whatever had returned to us wasn't David. It had his memories, his voice, his mannerisms, but it was something else wearing David's body like a suit of clothes. What convinced you? Small things at first. He never slept, never ate, though he went through the motions if we were watching. He had no pulse, no breathing pattern. But the final straw came when I found him in the basement one night talking to himself. Except he wasn't talking to himself. He was having conversations with people who weren't there. Dead people. Thomas paused to sip water from a plastic cup, his hands trembling slightly. I realized that David had become some kind of conduit between our world and whatever realm the dead inhabit. Through him, other spirits could communicate and could influence events in our world. And they weren't all benevolent spirits. What did you do? I confronted Ezekiel, demanded that he reverse whatever he'd done to David. But Ezekiel claimed he couldn't undo the process. Said that once someone was brought back, they remained that way permanently. Thomas's voice hardened. I threatened to expose him to the authorities, to tell everyone in Millbrook County what he was really doing. And that's when Clayton imprisoned you? Not immediately. First, they tried to convince me to keep quiet, offered me money, threatened my business, even suggested they could help other members of my family if anything happened to them. Thomas's face darkened. When I still refused to stay silent, they took more direct action. What happened to David? The night before Clayton captured me, something went wrong. David had been getting more erratic, more violent. He'd started hurting animals, small ones at first, then larger ones. The spirits speaking through him were becoming more demanding, more malevolent. Thomas closed his eyes. That final night, David attacked our mother. Not to hurt her, but to change her. To make her like him. Peter felt sick. Did he succeed? I stopped him. I had to. Thomas's voice broke. I killed my own brother, shot him in the head with our father's hunting rifle. But even then, even after I'd blown away half his skull, he kept moving for almost 10 minutes. Keep trying to reach our mother with his remaining hand. The hospital room fell silent, except for the steady beeping of monitoring equipment from other rooms. Peter struggled to process what he was hearing. It sounded like the plot of a horror movie, too outlandish to be real. But Thomas's obvious pain, his detailed memories, and the simple fact that he'd been imprisoned for 50 years suggested there might be truth to his story. The blanket, Peter said slowly. What's under the blanket? What's left of David? After I shot him, his body finally stopped moving, but it didn't decay like a normal corpse. Ezekiel claimed that was proof the ritual had worked, that David was truly between worlds. Clayton helped me wrap the body and hide it in the storage shed, thinking we could figure out what to do with it later. But instead, Clayton imprisoned you there with it. He said someone needed to guard it, to make sure it never got loose again. He was terrified that if anyone else discovered the body, they might try to study it, maybe even replicate Ezekiel's process. Thomas gripped Peter's arm, and he was right to be afraid. Because sometimes, late at night, I could swear I heard David moving under that blanket. Peter pulled back instinctively. Moving after all these years? Little sounds, shifting, rustling like someone trying to get comfortable. It only happened a few times a year, usually during storms or on the anniversary of his death. But it was enough to convince me that whatever Ezekiel did to David, it's still working. The implications hit Peter like a freight train. If Thomas was telling the truth, then there was an animated corpse hidden under that blanket. A body that had been shot in the head over 50 years ago but might still be somehow alive. Thomas, this is insane. You're talking about zombies, necromancy, and supernatural resurrection. These things don't exist. Then explain how I survived 50 years of imprisonment without going completely mad, Thomas said quietly. Explain why your grandfather and father were willing to commit such horrible crimes to keep this secret. Explain why I've dedicated my entire adult life to making sure that Blanket stays in place. Peter didn't have explanations for any of those things. The rational part of his mind insisted that Thomas was suffering from some form of psychological trauma, that decades of isolation had warped his perception of reality. But another part of him, a deeper, more primitive part, recognized the ring of truth in the old man's words. "There's something else," Thomas said. "Something I haven't told you yet." "What?" "David wasn't the only one. The Millbrook Circle performed their ritual on at least 6 other people that I know of. And I don't think all of those families were as decisive." As I was dealing with the results, Peter felt the blood drain from his face. "You mean there might be others? Other animated corpses? Not just corpses. Some of the people they brought back might still be walking around, decades later, still serving as conduits for whatever spirits want to use them. Still spreading whatever influence those entities have in our world." The room seemed to grow colder as Thomas spoke. Peter found himself thinking about the strange repairs to the shed's roof, the fresh lumber and new locks. Has someone been maintaining the building? Had there been recent activity at the homestead that Peter hadn't noticed? Who else was in this Millbrook Circle? Peter asked. Thomas recited names that Peter recognized from local history. Prominent businessmen, a judge, even a state legislator. All of them had died years ago, but their families still lived in the area. Their descendants owned banks, ran local government, and controlled much of the county's economic activity. "If what you're saying is true," Peter said slowly, "then this conspiracy involves some of the most powerful families in Colorado. Now you're beginning to understand why your grandfather was so desperate to keep me quiet. This wasn't just about protecting Ezekiel's reputation. It was about protecting an entire network of people who'd been involved in something that could destroy them all." Peter's phone buzzed with a text message from Sheriff Walsh. "FBI wants to examine the evidence under the blanket tomorrow morning." "Thought you should know." He showed the message to Thomas, who went pale. "You can't let them do it," Thomas said urgently. "If they lift that blanket, if they disturb David's body, there's no telling what might happen. He's been dormant for decades, but exposure to light, to air, to other people, it might reactivate whatever process Ezekiel used to bring him back. Thomas, even if I believed everything you've told me, I can't stop a federal investigation. They have warrants, legal authority, then you have to be there when they do it. You have to make sure they understand what they're dealing with. And if something goes wrong, if David starts moving again, you have to be prepared to do what I did 50 years ago." Peter stared at the old man, realizing that Thomas was asking him to potentially murder a federal crime scene. "I can't promise that." "Then God help us all," Thomas whispered. "Because if the Millbrook Circle's work becomes public knowledge, if people learn that the dead can be brought back, it won't just be David we'll have to worry about. Every grieving family, every desperate person who's lost someone they love, will want access to that power." As Peter left the hospital that evening, his mind was spinning with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. In less than 12 hours, FBI forensic specialists would lift that blanket and examine whatever lay beneath it. If Thomas was right, they might be unleashing something that had been contained for half a century. But if Thomas was wrong, if this was all the elaborate delusion of a man broken by decades of imprisonment, then Peter was about to become complicit in obstructing a federal investigation based on ghost stories and superstition. Either way, by tomorrow night, the Morrison family's darkest secret would finally be exposed. Peter just hoped they would all survive the revelation. Peter arrived at the homestead before dawn, his truck headlights cutting through the morning fog that clung to the cottonwood trees. Despite his exhaustion, he hadn't slept at all after leaving the hospital. Thomas's words echoed in his mind like a mantra. "You have to be there when they do it." The FBI command center had been established in the clearing near the old farmhouse. Mobile units, generator trucks, and communication equipment transformed the abandoned property into a bustling crime scene. Agent Sarah Chen, the lead investigator, greeted Peter with professional courtesy, but obvious suspicion. "Mr. Morrison, I understand you have concerns about our examination of the evidence, but I need to remind you that this is a federal crime scene. You'll need to observe from a safe distance. I just want to be present when you lift the blanket," Peter said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Mr. Hartwell specifically requested it." Agent Chen studied his face. "Any particular reason why?" Peter had rehearsed this moment during the sleepless hours of the previous night. "He's been the guardian of whatever's under there for 50 years. I think he deserves to have someone he trusts witness the moment his vigil finally ends." It was a partial truth, and Agent Chen seemed to accept it. She led Peter to the storage shed, where a full forensic team had assembled. Photographers, medical examiners, evidence specialists, and crime scene investigators clustered around the entrance, their equipment cases and cameras ready to document everything. Dr. Marcus Webb, the chief medical examiner, approached Peter with a clipboard. "I've reviewed Mr. Hartwell's statement about the remains. He claims they've been undisturbed since 1973. That would make this one of the oldest preserved crime scenes in Colorado history." "What are you expecting to find?" Peter asked. "Based on the time frame and environmental conditions, likely skeletal remains with some preserved tissue. The shed has provided protection from elements and scavengers, so we might have significant forensic evidence." Dr. Webb paused. "Mr. Hartwell made some unusual claims about the condition of the body, mentioned that it might not have decomposed normally. Have you observed anything that would support that?" Peter shook his head, not trusting himself to speak. How could he explain that, according to Thomas, the body under that blanket might still be somehow alive? The forensic team entered the shed in careful procession. Peter followed, staying near the doorway as instructed. The cell had been thoroughly photographed and documented, but the blanket-covered shape remained exactly as they'd found it 3 days earlier, in the bright LED lights the investigators had installed. The covered form looked less ominous, but somehow more real. "Beginning documentation of covered remains," Dr. Webb announced for the recording equipment. "Time is 7:23 a.m., October 15th. Present are Agent Chen, Dr. Martinez, photographer Stevens, and evidence specialist Rodriguez." Peter's heart hammered as Dr. Webb approached the blanket. The medical examiner pulled on latex gloves and positioned himself at what appeared to be the head of the covered form. "Mr. Morrison," Agent Chen called from behind him. "You mentioned Mr. Hartwell had specific concerns about this examination. Can you elaborate?" "He's worried about exposure to light and air," Peter said carefully. "Claims the body has been preserved in very specific conditions," Dr. Webb nodded. "That's actually good forensic practice. We'll document everything before making any changes to the environment." The photographer began taking pictures from multiple angles, while Dr. Webb made notes about the blanket's position and condition. The wool covering was indeed moth-eaten and filthy, but it had apparently protected whatever lay beneath it for decades. The blanket appears to be a standard wool military surplus item. "Probably from the 1960s, Dr. Webb observed. "There are no obvious signs of disturbance." "Beginning removal now." Peter held his breath as Dr. Webb grasped one corner of the blanket. Thomas's warnings rang in his ears. If they lift that blanket, if they disturb David's body, there's no telling what might happen. The medical examiner lifted the blanket slowly, revealing what lay beneath inch by inch. The first thing Peter saw was hair. Dark brown hair that looked far too fresh for something that had been dead for 50 years. Then pale skin, almost grey but not decomposed. As more of the body became visible, Peter felt his rational worldview crumbling. The figure under the blanket was that of a young man, perhaps 19 or 20 years old. His clothes were dated but well preserved, bell-bottom jeans and a plaid shirt typical of the early 1970s, but it was the condition of the body that defied explanation. Despite Thomas's claim that he'd shot his brother in the head, there was no visible wound. The young man's face was intact, peaceful, as if he were merely sleeping. "Jesus Christ," whispered one of the evidence specialists. Dr. Webb stared at the body in obvious confusion. "This isn't possible." According to our timeline, these remains should be over 50 years old. Agent Chen moved closer, her professional composure wavering. Could this be a different body? Maybe something more recent. The clothing is clearly from the 1970s, Dr. Webb replied, and the cell shows no signs of recent disturbance until 3 days ago. He leaned closer to examine the body's face. But this level of preservation is unprecedented. The skin shows no signs of decomposition, no mummification, nothing consistent with normal post-mortem changes. Peter found himself stepping closer despite his fear. The young man did indeed look as if he were simply asleep. His chest didn't rise and fall with breathing, but there was something almost lifelike about his appearance. As Peter watched, he could have sworn he saw the faintest movement in the body's eyelids. "Doctor," the photographer said urgently, "you need to see this." Dr. Webb followed the photographer's pointing finger to the young man's hands. The fingers were slightly curled, as if gripping something, but what caught everyone's attention was the condition of the fingernails. They appeared to have grown significantly, extending well beyond the fingertips in long, yellowed curves. "That's consistent with continued keratin production," Dr. Webb muttered. "But that would require active cellular metabolism. What does that mean?" Agent Chen asked. "It means this body has been biologically active long after death and should have stopped all cellular function." As if responding to their voices, the young man's eyes suddenly snapped open. The scream that erupted from the evidence specialist echoed through the shed and across the homestead. The young man's eyes were exactly as Thomas had described them, completely black, like looking into an abyss. But worse than their appearance was the intelligence behind them. This wasn't the vacant stare of a corpse. Something was looking back at them. The body sat up with a fluid motion that seemed to defy rigor mortis. Its head turned toward the group of investigators, and when it smiled, Peter saw that its teeth had grown as long as its fingernails, creating a grotesque parody of a human expression. "Thank you," the thing that had been David Hartwell said in a voice like rustling leaves. "I've been waiting so long to stretch." Chaos erupted in the shed. The photographer dropped his camera and bolted for the door. Dr. Webb stumbled backward, knocking over equipment. Agent Chen reached for her weapon while shouting orders that no one could hear over the screaming. But Peter stood frozen, transfixed by the horror of what he was witnessing. Thomas had been telling the truth. Everything he'd said about the Millbrook Circle, about the reanimation rituals, about his brother's resurrection, was real. The creature that had been David Hartwell rose to its feet with impossible grace. Its movements were fluid but wrong, as if it had forgotten how human joints were supposed to work. It looked around the shed with obvious curiosity, its black eyes reflecting the LED lights like a nocturnal animal's. "So much has changed," it said, its voice carrying undertones that seemed to come from multiple sources. "I can hear them calling. All the others. They've been waiting too." Agent Chen had her service weapon drawn, though her hands shook visibly. "Everyone out of the shed, now!" The creature laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Bullets didn't stop me 50 years ago. They won't stop me now." It looked directly at Peter. "You must be another Morrison. You have the family look. Tell me, is Ezekiel still alive?" "He died in 1989, Peter managed to say. "Pity. I was looking forward to thanking him for the gift he gave me." The creature's smile widened impossibly. "But perhaps his descendants will serve just as well." Peter finally found the ability to move. He backed toward the door, keeping his eyes on the creature. "What do you want?" "What I've always wanted. To complete the work the Circle started." The thing that had been David stepped out of the cell, its bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. "And to open the door between worlds permanently. To bring all of them back." Agent Chen fired 3 shots in rapid succession. The bullet struck the creature's center mass, but instead of falling, it merely looked down at the holes in its shirt with mild interest. No blood flowed from the wounds. "Rude," it said, then moved faster than human reflexes should allow. Agent Chen screamed as the creature reached her, its elongated fingernails raking across her face. But instead of killing her, it simply touched her forehead with one finger. Immediately, Agent Chen's struggles ceased. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and when they focused again, they were completely black. "Much better," the creature said. "Now we can work together." Peter ran. He burst out of the shed and sprinted toward the command center, shouting warnings that sounded insane even to his own ears. FBI agents and forensic specialists looked up from there, equipment in confusion as Peter babbled about animated corpses and possessed federal agents. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came when Agent Chen walked calmly out of the shed, her face covered in bloody scratches, but her expression eerily peaceful. Behind her came the creature that had been David Hartwell, moving with predatory confidence. "The situation is under control," Agent Chen announced to her colleagues. "The remains have been successfully examined and documented. Dr. Webb requires immediate assistance in the shed." Several agents started toward the building, but Peter grabbed the nearest one. "Don't go in there! Something's wrong with Chen. Look at her eyes." The agent stared at Agent Chen's face and immediately drew his weapon. Her eyes were indeed completely black, just like the creature's. But before anyone could react, she moved with inhuman speed, touching each of the nearby agents on the forehead. One by one, their eyes turned black and their resistance ceased. Within minutes, half the federal task force had been transformed into something else. They moved in perfect coordination, their black eyes reflecting an intelligence that wasn't entirely human. The creature that had been David Hartwell stood among them like a general, surveying his troops. "Excellent," it said. "Now we can begin the real work." The Circle's rituals were incomplete, you see. They could bring individuals back, but they couldn't open the permanent gateway we needed. But with modern resources, with federal authority, with access to every morgue and cemetery in the country, Peter understood with horrible clarity what the creature was planning. It intended to use the possessed federal agents to access death records, to locate the bodies of everyone the Millbrook Circle had ever reanimated. And then it would wake them all up. The remaining unaffected agents were backing away, speaking urgently into their radios and calling for backup. But Peter knew that conventional law enforcement would be useless against what they were facing. This wasn't a criminal matter anymore. It was something far worse. As sirens wailed in the distance and the possessed agents began loading equipment into their vehicles, Peter made a desperate decision. He pulled out his cell phone and called the only person who might know how to stop what was happening. "Thomas," he said when the old man answered. They lifted the blanket. "David's awake, and he's possessed half the FBI task force. What should I do?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched for an eternity before Thomas finally spoke. "Run," he whispered. "Run as far and as fast as you can, because what you're seeing now is just the beginning." As Peter watched the convoy of federal vehicles drive away from his property, each one filled with agents whose black eyes reflected an ancient and malevolent intelligence, he realized that the Morrison family's darkest secret had finally been unleashed upon the world, and there was no putting it back. Peter drove through the night, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Thomas's words echoed in his mind. "Run as far and as fast as you can." But where could someone run from possessed federal agents with unlimited resources and supernatural abilities? He'd abandoned the ranch without packing, taking only his wallet, phone, and the .45 caliber pistol he kept in his truck's glove compartment. Behind him, the Morrison homestead was dark, except for the red and blue flashes of emergency vehicles that continued to arrive throughout the evening. By morning, the entire area would be swarming with law enforcement, trying to make sense of what had happened to their missing colleagues. Peter's phone rang as he crossed the Colorado-Wyoming border. The caller ID showed Thomas's hospital number. "Where are you?" Thomas asked without preamble. "Heading north on I-25. I don't know where I'm going." "Good. Keep moving. David and his new allies will be tracking federal resources to find you. They need you alive. Why? Because you're a Morrison. Your family's blood opened the original gateway for the Circle's rituals. David will need that same bloodline to complete what Ezekiel started. Thomas's voice carried a weight of terrible knowledge. Listen carefully. There's someone you need to find. A woman named Dr. Elena Vasquez. She's a professor of anthropology at the University of New Mexico, specializing in indigenous burial practices and folklore surrounding death rituals. How will she help? Eleanor's grandmother was one of the original opponents of the Millbrook Circle. Back in the 1960s, there was a small group of local Native Americans who recognized what Ezekiel and his followers were attempting. They tried to stop the rituals, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered by men with political and economic power. Peter pulled into a gas station in Cheyenne, keeping his eyes on the road behind him. No black SUVs yet, but that could change quickly. Elena has spent her career documenting the traditional methods for dealing with corrupted spirits and unnatural resurrections. If anyone knows how to stop David and reverse what the Circle accomplished, it's her. Thomas, even if I find this woman, even if she has answers, how do we fight something that can possess federal agents? David has access to government databases, FBI resources, unlimited funding. We use the one advantage we have, Thomas interrupted. David may have awakened after 50 years, but he's still operating with a 1970s understanding of the modern world. He doesn't fully comprehend what technology can do, how surveillance works, how information spreads. We can stay ahead of him if we're smart. Peter paid for gas with cash, avoiding credit cards that could be traced. As he filled his tank, he noticed a news report playing on the gas station's television. The anchor was discussing a training exercise at a rural Colorado ranch that had resulted in several federal agents being hospitalized with an unknown neurological condition. The official story bore no resemblance to what Peter had witnessed. They're already covering it up, he told Thomas as he got back on the road. Of course they are. David is using the possessed agents to control the narrative. But that works in our favor too. If the government is denying what happened, it means they don't have a plan to deal with it. Peter drove through the night, switching between interstate highways and back roads, always heading generally southwest toward New Mexico. He'd grown up on the ranch, learned to navigate by stars and landmarks before GPS existed. Those skills served him well now as he avoided major cities and stayed on routes that would be harder to monitor electronically. Dawn found him in northern New Mexico, exhausted but still moving. He'd stopped twice for coffee and gas, each time scanning the area for any sign of pursuit. The landscape had changed from Colorado's rolling plains to New Mexico's high desert, with red rock formations and ancient mesas rising from the scrubland. As the sun climbed higher, Peter's phone rang again. This time the caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. Peter Morrison. The voice was female, middle-aged, with a slight accent that might have been Spanish. Who is this? Dr. Elena Vasquez. Thomas Hartwell called me from the hospital. He said you'd be coming to find me. Peter felt a surge of relief. Dr. Vasquez, I need your help. What Thomas told you about what happened at my ranch is true. I've been expecting something like this for years. Her voice was calm, professional, but carried an undertone of urgency.
Where are you now?
About an hour north of Santa Fe. Good. Don't come to the university. Meet me at the Bandelier National Monument Visitor Center. There's a coffee shop there. I'll be waiting. Bandelier turned out to be a sprawling archaeological site, preserving ancient Pueblo cliff dwellings and ceremonial structures. Peter found Dr. Vasquez exactly where she'd promised, sitting at a corner table in the visitor center cafe with a laptop computer and several thick books spread before her. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 45, with graying black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her clothes were field-appropriate khakis and hiking boots, but her eyes held the kind of deep intelligence that Peter associated with serious academics. "You look like your great-grandfather," she said, as Peter sat down across from her. "I've seen photographs of Ezekiel Morrison in my grandmother's papers. Your grandmother knew him." "Unfortunately, yes. She was Maria Vasquez, one of the traditional healers from the San Ildefonso Pueblo. When word spread about what the Millbrook Circle was attempting, the tribal elders sent her to investigate. Elena opened one of her books, revealing pages covered with handwritten notes and sketched symbols. What she found horrified her. The book contained detailed accounts of the circle's activities, written in careful Spanish and English. Peter saw references to names he recognized from Thomas's story, along with descriptions of rituals that made his skin crawl. The circle wasn't just bringing people back from the dead, Eleanor explained. They were creating doorways. Each successful resurrection opened a small gateway between our world and what my grandmother called the shadow realm, the place where corrupted spirits dwell. Thomas mentioned that David could communicate with other dead people. More than communicating, each reanimated person becomes a permanent anchor point, allowing spirits from the shadow realm to influence events in our world. The more anchors that exist, the stronger the connection becomes. Elena turned to a page covered with intricate geometric designs. My grandmother believed that if enough anchors were established, the barrier between worlds would collapse entirely. Peter studied the symbols on the page. They looked like a combination of mathematical equations and religious iconography, far more complex than anything he'd expected from traditional folklore. How many people did the circle bring back? My grandmother documented 14 successful resurrections between 1967 and 1972, but she suspected there were others that weren't recorded. Elena pulled out a manila folder containing photocopied newspaper clippings. I've spent 20 years tracking down the families involved, trying to determine what happened to the reanimated individuals. The clippings were obituaries and missing person reports from the late 1960s and early 1970s. Peter recognized several family names from prominent Millbrook County residents, but what caught his attention were the dates. Many of the deaths had occurred within weeks of each other, as if the circle had been working on some kind of schedule. What did you find? 3 of the reanimated individuals were destroyed by their families, like David Hartwell, but 11 others simply disappeared from official records. No death certificates, no burial records, nothing. They vanished as completely as if they'd never existed. You think they're still out there? I think David is going to try to find them. And with federal resources at his disposal, he probably will. Elena closed the book and leaned forward. But there's something else you need to understand. The circle's rituals required specific astronomical conditions, alignments of celestial bodies that only occur at certain times. What kind of alignments? According to my grandmother's notes, the most powerful rituals could only be performed during a conjunction of Mars and Saturn that happens roughly every 30 years. The last one occurred in 1972, right before the circle's activities ended. Peter felt a chill of premonition. When is the next one? 3 days from now. October 18th. And this conjunction will be even more powerful than the one in 1972 because it's occurring during a total lunar eclipse. Elena's expression was grim. If David can gather enough of the original anchors together and perform the completion ritual during that window, he won't just open small doorways to the shadow realm. He'll tear down the entire barrier. What would that mean? Every person who's ever died would have the potential to return, but not as themselves, as vessels for the shadow realm entities. The world of the living and the world of the dead would merge, with the shadow realm spirits in control of both. Peter struggled to process the implications. How do we stop him? Elena opened her laptop and showed Peter a digital map marked with red dots scattered across the western United States. These are the locations where I believe the missing reanimated individuals might be found. David will try to collect them systematically, probably using the possessed federal agents to access records and coordinate searches. That's a lot of ground to cover in 3 days, which is why we need to get there first. My grandmother left detailed instructions for a counter-ritual that can sever the connection between the shadow realm and our world. But it has to be performed at the original site where the circle first opened the doorway, the Morrison homestead. Exactly. And we need to complete the counter-ritual before David can gather enough anchors for his completion ceremony. Elena began packing her books and laptop. But first we need allies, people who understand what we're facing and have the skills to help us fight it. What kind of allies? Other families whose ancestors were involved with the circle. Some of them have been preparing for this day for generations, keeping records, maintaining vigilance, waiting for the moment when the old horrors would return. Eleanor handed Peter a list of names and addresses. These are people we can trust. People who know the truth about what their relatives did and who've dedicated their lives to making amends. Peter looked at the list. The addresses were spread across 4 states, from Montana to Arizona. We can't reach all of these people in 3 days. We don't have to. We just need enough to perform the counter-ritual. According to my grandmother's notes, 7 people with direct bloodline connections to the original circle members can close the doorway permanently. Elena stood up, shouldering her backpack. But we need to move fast. Every hour we waste is an hour David can use to grow stronger. As they walked toward the parking lot, Peter's phone buzzed with a news alert. The headline made his blood run cold. Federal Task Force reports breakthrough in missing persons cold cases. The article mentioned that FBI agents had made significant progress in locating individuals who had disappeared decades ago, with several cases expected to be resolved within the next 72 hours. He's already started, Peter said, showing Elena the alert. She read the article quickly, her face growing pale. We're out of time. David isn't just looking for the missing anchors, he's found them. We need to reach the other bloodline families immediately. As Peter started his truck, he realized that the next 3 days would determine the fate of the world. Either they would succeed in performing Elena's grandmother's counter-ritual, or David Hartwell would complete what the Millbrook Circle had started 50 years ago. The race against supernatural forces, armed with federal resources, had begun, and Peter wasn't sure the living had any chance of winning. The abandoned warehouse in Flagstaff, Arizona, looked innocuous enough from the outside, just another rust-stained industrial building in a forgotten part of town. But as Peter and Elena approached the loading dock, the temperature dropped noticeably despite the desert heat. Frost formed on the metal door handles in patterns that looked almost like ancient script. "This is definitely the place," Eleanor whispered, consulting her grandmother's notes. The Blackwood family has been guarding Resurrection Number 7 for almost 50 years. They'd driven straight through the night after leaving Bondelier, stopping only for gas, and hurried phone calls to the other bloodline families. The responses had been mixed. 2 families were already missing, their phones disconnected and houses empty. 3 others had agreed to meet at designated locations. But the Blackwoods had been the most urgent, claiming that something was stirring in their protected site. Margaret Blackwood answered their coded knock. 3 short, 2 long, 1 short. She was a woman in her 70s with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much. Her grandfather had been one of the circle's most enthusiastic participants, until the night his resurrected wife tried to murder their children. "Thank God you're here," Margaret said, ushering them inside. "Something's changed. After 48 years of perfect stillness, it started moving again yesterday evening. The warehouse interior had been converted into something between a prison and a shrine. Heavy steel bars created a central cage, surrounded by protective symbols carved into the concrete floor. Candles burned continuously in precise geometric patterns, their flames never wavering despite the absence of any windows or air circulation. Inside the cage lay a figure on a simple cot, covered by multiple layers of blankets and restraints. Even through the coverings, Peter could see subtle movement, the rise and fall of breathing that shouldn't exist. "Rebecca Blackwood," Margaret explained. "My great-aunt. She died in 1970 when a drunk driver hit her car. My grandfather paid the circle $10,000 to bring her back." Margaret's voice carried decades of regret. It worked, but what came back wasn't Rebecca. It was something else wearing her face. Elena approached the cage, pulling out a device that looked like a modified electromagnetic field detector. The readings made her frown. The spiritual energy levels are off the charts. Whatever's happening with the other anchors, it's affecting this one too. That's not the worst part, Margaret said. She led them to a bank of monitors showing security camera feeds from around the building. Watch camera 7. The screen showed the warehouse's rear entrance. As they watched, a black SUV with government plates pulled into the alley. 4 figures in FBI windbreakers emerged, but their movements were too coordinated, too fluid. When the camera caught their faces, their eyes reflected the light like nocturnal predators. David's people, Peter said grimly. How did they find us so fast? The anchors called to each other, Elena replied, studying her grandmother's notes frantically. As David awakens more of them, the psychic resonance grows stronger. They can sense each other across vast distances. Margaret was already moving, pulling weapons from hidden compartments around the warehouse. I've been preparing for this day my entire life. My family's sins don't die with us. They get passed down like a curse. The possessed agents didn't bother with subtlety. They simply walked through the warehouse's main entrance, the steel doors bending and warping as if made of paper. Their leader was a tall woman with Agent Chen's face, but movements that belonged to something ancient and predatory. Margaret Blackwood, the thing wearing Chen's body, called out, "Your vigil is over. Surrender the anchor, and your death will be swift." "Go to hell," Margaret replied. Raising a shotgun loaded with shells she claimed were blessed by 3 different religions, the battle was brief but vicious. Margaret's blessed ammunition had some effect on the possessed agents, causing them to stagger and retreat, but they adapted quickly. One agent grabbed a steel pipe and threw it with enough force to embed it 6 inches into the concrete wall where Margaret had been standing. Elena was working frantically with her equipment, trying to set up some kind of protective barrier around Rebecca's cage. "I need more time," she shouted over the sound of gunfire and inhuman snarling. Peter found himself face to face with the thing wearing Agent Chen's body. Up close, he could see that the possession was incomplete. Fragments of the real Chen occasionally flickered across her features, as if the original personality was fighting for control. "Help me," Chen's real voice whispered through black lips. Peter hesitated, and that moment of compassion nearly cost him his life. The entity regained control instantly, lunging forward with fingernails that had grown into claws. Only Margaret's intervention, a blessed silver knife thrust between the creature's ribs, gave Peter the chance to escape. But their victory was temporary. Even as the possessed agent collapsed, the figure in the cage was stirring. After nearly 50 years of dormancy, Rebecca Blackwood was waking up. The restraints that had held her for decades snapped like tissue paper. The blankets fell away, revealing a woman who looked exactly as she had in 1970, mid-30s, blonde hair, wearing a dress that had been fashionable half a century ago. But her skin had the same grey pallor as David's, and when her eyes opened, they were pools of absolute darkness. "Sister," Rebecca said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from multiple throats. "I heard your call. The time has come." Margaret raised her shotgun, but her hands were shaking. "You're not Rebecca. Rebecca died in 1970. Rebecca died, yes, but death is just a doorway. And now all the doors are opening." The creature that wore Rebecca's face stood with fluid grace, stretching as if waking from a long nap. "David has found most of us. The gathering is nearly complete." Elena finished her preparations and activated her device. A low humming filled the warehouse, and the protective symbols carved into the floor began to glow with pale blue light. Rebecca hissed and stepped back, her form wavering like heat distortion. "Clever girl," Rebecca said. "Your grandmother taught you well. But you cannot hold us forever." "We don't need forever," Elena replied. "Just long enough." Through the warehouse windows, Peter could see more vehicles arriving. Not just government SUVs now, but civilian cars, delivery trucks, even a school bus. all of them disgorging passengers whose movements carried the same inhuman coordination. The whole network, Margaret breathed. David's gathering everyone he's possessed. This isn't just about collecting the anchors anymore. Elena's face went pale as she checked her astronomical charts. The conjunction starts tonight. David's not waiting for the peak alignment. He's beginning the completion ritual early. She looked at Peter with desperate urgency. We need to get back to Colorado now. What about Rebecca? Peter asked. Elena made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She began disabling her protective barrier. We can't save them all, but we can still stop the ritual. As the blue light faded, Rebecca smiled with predatory satisfaction. Run, little mortals. Run back to your ranch. David is waiting for you there. He has such wonderful plans for the Morrison bloodline. Margaret grabbed Peter's arm as they headed for the rear exit. Take this, she said, pressing an ancient leather journal into his hands. My grandfather's records of the original rituals. If Belena's counter-ritual fails, this might give you another option. They escaped through the loading dock as the warehouse filled with possessed agents and reanimated corpses. Behind them, Rebecca's laughter echoed across the desert night, a sound like breaking glass mixed with children's screams. As they drove north toward Colorado, Elena worked frantically with her laptop, trying to coordinate with the remaining bloodline families. 2 more had gone silent. The ones still responding reported similar attacks. Sudden appearances of possessed agents, the awakening of long-dormant anchors, the gathering of forces that defied rational explanation. We're down to 4 families, Elena said, her voice tight with stress. 4 people with the bloodline connections needed for the counter-ritual. Is that enough? It has to be. According to my grandmother's notes, the minimum requirement is 3 direct descendants and 1 from the Morrison line. She looked at Peter grimly. You're the key to everything. Without Morrison blood, the counter-ritual can't work. Peter opened Margaret's grandfather's journal as they drove. The pages were filled with detailed accounts of the Circle's experiments, written in cramped handwriting that grew increasingly erratic as the entries progressed. But it was the final entry that caught his attention. The things we have awakened are not our loved ones. They are parasites, wearing familiar faces to hide their true nature. Each resurrection opens another crack in the wall between worlds. Ezekiel believes we can control what comes through, but he is wrong. We are not the masters of this power. We are its servants. God forgive us all. As they crossed the Colorado state line, Peter's phone rang. The caller ID showed his ranch's landline number. Peter Morrison, a familiar voice said when he answered. But it wasn't quite right. David's voice carried the same harmonic distortions as Rebecca's. Welcome home. I have something that belongs to you. The line went dead, but not before Peter heard something in the background that made his blood freeze. It was Thomas Hartwell's voice screaming in agony. The trap was set. David had the original sight, he had Thomas, and soon he would have the astronomical alignment he needed to complete the Circle's work. Peter and Elena were walking into the jaws of supernatural forces that had been planning this moment for over 50 years. And they had less than 12 hours to save not just Thomas, but the entire world. The Morrison homestead had been transformed into something out of a nightmare. As Peter and Elena approached through the cottonwood trees in the pre-dawn darkness, they could see unnatural lights dancing between the buildings, not electric illumination, but something that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life. The old farmhouse, which had stood empty for decades, now showed signs of recent occupation. Every window blazed with that strange, shifting light, and shadows moved behind the glass in patterns that hurt to watch directly. The storage shed, where Thomas had been imprisoned for 50 years, had been torn open, its walls scattered like kindling. But it was the barn that made Peter's breath catch in his throat. Someone had painted symbols across its entire surface, the same geometric patterns Elena's grandmother had documented, but vastly larger and more complex. The symbols seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering light. creating optical illusions that made Peter's eyes water. "The completion array," Elena whispered, consulting her grandmother's notes while shaking hands. David's turned the entire homestead into a massive ritual site. They'd lost contact with the remaining bloodline families during the drive from Arizona. Elena's laptop showed their last known positions, but when she tried calling, every number went straight to voicemail. Peter suspected they were either dead or had joined the growing ranks of David's possessed servants. "We can't wait for the others," Peter said grimly. "If the ritual requires Morrison blood to work, maybe it also requires Morrison blood to stop it." Eleanor checked her astronomical charts. "The conjunction peaks in 2 hours. Mars and Saturn will be perfectly aligned during the lunar eclipse. If we're going to attempt the counter-ritual, it has to be now." They approached the farmhouse cautiously, using the cover of the outbuildings to avoid the open ground around the barn. As they drew closer, Peter could hear something that made his skin crawl, voices, dozens of them chanting in unison. But the words weren't in any language he recognized. Through a broken window, Peter glimpsed the interior of the farmhouse. The walls had been stripped bare, and more symbols covered every surface. Candles burned in elaborate patterns on the floor, their flames an unhealthy green color that cast dancing shadows across the room. At the center of it all stood David Hartwell, no longer bothering to maintain the pretense of humanity. His skin had taken on a translucent quality, revealing dark veins that pulsed with otherworldly energy. His black eyes reflected the candlelight like mirrors, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that seemed to come from every direction at once. Around him stood the other anchors, 11 figures in various states of decay and supernatural preservation. Peter recognized Rebecca Blackwood among them, along with others whose clothing and hairstyles dated them to different decades. They stood in perfect formation, each one positioned at a specific point in the array painted on the floor. But it was the figure bound to a chair in the corner that made Peter's heart clench with rage. Thomas Hartwell sat motionless, his hospital gown torn and bloody, his eyes closed. For a terrible moment, Peter thought the old man was dead. Then Thomas raised his head slightly, and Peter saw that his eyes, while bruised and swollen, were still their natural brown color. "The anchor points are established," David announced to his assembled followers. "The conjunction approaches its peak. Soon the barrier between worlds will fall, and the Shadow Realm will claim dominion over the living and the dead." One of the possessed FBI agents stepped forward, the same one who had worn Agent Chen's face, though the features had become increasingly distorted over the past few days. "What of the Morrison descendants?" "Our scouts reported his approach," David smiled, revealing teeth that had grown into needle-sharp points. "Peter Morrison will come to us. His bloodline compels him to be present for the completion of what his great-grandfather began. When the ritual reaches its climax, his willing participation will ensure our success. And if he refuses to participate willingly," Rebecca asked, her voice like rustling autumn leaves, "then we will use Thomas Hartwell to motivate him. The old man has guarded our secret for 50 years. It would be poetic if his suffering served to unlock the final door." Elena gripped Peter's arm. "We need to get closer. The counter-ritual has to be performed from within the array itself, using the same power sources David is drawing from." They circled around to the farmhouse's rear entrance, moving through shadows that seemed to reach out for them with grasping fingers. The back door stood open, revealing a hallway lined with more of the writhing symbols. As they stepped inside, the temperature dropped dramatically, and their breath came out in visible puffs. The chanting grew louder as they approached the main room. Elena pulled out her equipment, a collection of items that looked like a cross between scientific instruments and religious artifacts. She'd spent the drive from Arizona preparing them according to her grandmother's instructions, blessing each component with prayers in 3 different languages. "Remember," she whispered, "the counter-ritual requires blood from a Morrison descendant freely given. But it has to be at the exact moment when David's ritual reaches its peak. Too early, and we won't have enough power to work with. Too late, and the barrier will already be destroyed." Peter nodded, drawing the silver knife Margaret Blackwood had given him. The blade was inscribed with symbols that matched those in Elena's grandmother's notes, protective wards that had been passed down through generations of people trying to atone for their ancestors' mistakes. They entered the main room just as David raised his arms toward the ceiling. Through the farmhouse's windows, Peter could see the lunar eclipse beginning, a red shadow creeping across the moon's surface as Earth moved between it and the sun. "The blood moon rises," David proclaimed. "The conjunction is upon us. Let the final barrier fall." The 11 anchors began moving in a complex pattern around the room, their footsteps perfectly synchronized despite the absence of any audible rhythm. As they moved, the symbols on the walls began to glow more brightly, and the air itself seemed to thicken with supernatural energy. Peter felt a pull in his chest, as if something was trying to drag him forward into the ritual circle. The Morrison blood in his veins resonated with the same forces his great-grandfather had channeled decades earlier. Every instinct screamed at him to join the dance, to take his place in the pattern that his bloodline had helped create. "Fight it!" Elena hissed, grabbing his arm. "That's exactly what David wants." Thomas raised his head with obvious effort, his eyes focusing on Peter with desperate intensity. "Don't let them use you," the old man gasped. "Your blood, willing or not, it opens the final door." David's head snapped around at the sound of Thomas's voice, his black eyes fixed on Peter with predatory satisfaction. "Peter Morrison, welcome home. Your timing is perfect." The dancing anchors stopped moving, forming a circle around Peter and Elena. Up close, Peter could see the true horror of what the Millbrook Circle had created. These weren't resurrected people. They were empty shells, animated by entities that had never been human. Their skin showed the mottled discoloration of advanced decomposition, but they moved with fluid grace that defied the laws of biology. "Your great-grandfather was a visionary," David said, approaching slowly. "He understood that death is not an ending, but a transition. The Shadow Realm offers unlimited power, unlimited knowledge, unlimited existence. All it requires is a doorway." "And the price?" Peter asked, backing toward the wall. "What price?" "The living become vessels for superior beings. The dead reclaim their rightful place in the world. Everyone wins. Everyone except the people whose bodies you steal." David laughed, the sound like breaking glass mixed with children's screams. "Bodies are just vehicles. Consciousness is temporary, but what we offer is eternal." Elena was working frantically with her equipment, trying to set up the counter-ritual while the anchor's attention was focused on Peter. She'd managed to place several blessed objects at key points around the room, but she needed more time to complete the array. Outside, the eclipse was reaching totality. The moon hung in the sky like a drop of blood, and the conjunction of Mars and Saturn blazed with unnatural brightness. Peter could feel the astronomical alignment affecting the very fabric of reality around them. The air crackled with energy that made his hair stand on end. "The moment approaches," David announced. "Peter Morrison, you will take your place in the circle. Your blood will complete what Ezekiel began. The Shadow Realm will merge with our world, and the age of the living will end." "Never," Peter said, raising Margaret's blessed knife. David's expression shifted from anticipation to annoyance. "Then Thomas Hartwell will suffer for your stubbornness." Rebecca moved toward Thomas with inhuman speed, her fingernails extending into claws. But before she could reach him, Elena completed her preparations and activated the counter-ritual. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The symbols on the walls began flickering between the sickly green of David's ritual and the pure blue of Elena's grandmother's protective magic. The anchors staggered as conflicting energies tore at their stolen forms. "Now!" Elena shouted. "Peter, now!" Peter didn't hesitate. He drew the blessed knife across his palm, letting his blood fall onto the silver disc Elena had placed at the center of her array. The Morrison blood hit the blessed metal with a sound like thunder. And suddenly the room was filled with competing forces of unimaginable power. David screamed in rage and pain as the counter-ritual began unraveling his carefully constructed network. The anchors writhed and convulsed as the entities possessing them were pulled back toward the Shadow Realm. Several of the possessed FBI agents collapsed entirely, their eyes returning to normal human colors as their consciousness was restored. But David wasn't finished. Drawing on reserves of power that made the air around him shimmer with heat distortion, he lunged toward Peter with claws extended. "If I cannot complete the ritual, then I will ensure no Morrison lives to interfere with future attempts." The blessed knife met David's claws in a shower of sparks that burned like miniature stars. Peter felt the impact travel up his arm as supernatural forces clashed with blessed silver. David's strength was incredible, but the knife held protective enchantments that had been forged specifically to combat the Shadow Realm's influence. Elena's counter-ritual reached its climax as the lunar eclipse peaked overhead. The symbols on the walls blazed with competing energies, and reality itself seemed to bend and warp around the conflicting forces. Through the chaos, Peter could see Thomas struggling to free himself from his bonds, the old man's face set with grim determination. "The doorway!" Eleanor shouted over the supernatural storm. "It's closing!" But David's fighting it. Peter saw what she meant. David's form was becoming translucent, as if he was being pulled back into whatever realm he'd emerged from. But he was anchoring himself to the physical world through sheer force of will, using his connection to the other anchors to maintain his presence. With sudden clarity, Peter understood what needed to be done. The counter-ritual required willing sacrifice from the Morrison bloodline, not just blood, but life itself. The same forces that had opened the original doorway could only be sealed by someone with the power to have opened it in the first place. "Elena," he called out, "can the ritual work without me?" "What do you mean?" "If I go through the doorway with David, if I follow him back to the Shadow Realm, will that seal it permanently?" Elena's face went pale as she understood his meaning. "Peter, no. You don't know what's on the other side. You might not just die, you might be trapped there forever. But it would work. According to my grandmother's notes, yes, a willing Morrison descendant crossing into the Shadow Realm would create a permanent seal." But Peter didn't wait for her to finish. He grabbed David around the waist and threw himself toward the largest of the glowing symbols on the wall. As they hit the barrier between worlds, Peter felt reality dissolve around him like sugar in water. The last thing he saw was Thomas Hartwell breaking free from his bonds, the old man's eyes bright with something that might have been pride or forgiveness. Then the farmhouse, Elena's desperate face, and the entire world disappeared into swirling darkness, shot through with veins of impossible color. Peter found himself falling through a realm that existed outside normal space and time. David was still with him, but the creature's form was changing, becoming something angular and terrible that hurt to look at directly. Around them, other entities moved through the endless twilight, beings that had never been human, things that fed on the boundary between life and death. "You fool," David snarled, his voice now completely inhuman. "You've trapped yourself here forever. The Shadow Realm doesn't release what it claims." "Maybe," Peter replied, feeling the silver knife still clutched in his hand. "But at least the doorway is sealed. You'll never threaten my world again." David's laughter echoed through the impossible dimensions around them. "This isn't over, Morrison. Your sacrifice only delays the inevitable. Others will come. Others will seek the power your great-grandfather discovered. And eventually, someone will succeed in opening a new doorway." Peter smiled grimly. "Then I guess I'll just have to make sure they don't." The knife in his hand began to glow with the same blue light as Elena's protective symbols. Somehow, the blessings Margaret Blackwood's family had placed on the blade were still active, even in this realm beyond death. Peter realized that he wasn't as powerless here as David believed. As the two of them continued falling through the endless shadows, Peter began to understand his true purpose. He wasn't just a sacrifice to seal the doorway, he was a guardian, placed in the shadow realm to ensure that no entity like David could ever again threaten the world of the living. Back in the farmhouse, Elena watched as the symbols on the walls flickered once more and then went completely dark. The anchors had collapsed, their stolen animation finally ended. The possessed agents blinked in confusion as their minds were restored. And Thomas Hartwell sat in his broken chair, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Is it over?" Thomas asked. Elena checked her instruments. The electromagnetic readings had returned to normal. The temperature was rising. Outside, the lunar eclipse was ending, and the conjunction of Mars and Saturn was fading as the planets continued their eternal dance. "The doorway is sealed," she said quietly. "Peter's sacrifice worked. But the knowledge is still out there. Ezekiel's journals, the Circle's records, other families who might try to repeat what was done here." Thomas struggled to his feet, his legs still weak from his captivity. "Then we have work to do. Peter bought us time, but you're right, this isn't truly over. There will always be people desperate enough to try communicating with the dead." As the sun rose over the Morrison homestead, Eleanor and Thomas began the grim task of cleaning up the aftermath of 50 years of supernatural horror. They would burn the journals, scatter the ashes of the anchors, and work to ensure that the Millbrook Circle's dark legacy was finally put to rest. But sometimes, late at night, Elena thought she could hear a faint sound carried on the wind, the whisper of a voice from beyond the barrier between worlds, still standing guard in the endless shadows, making sure that certain doors remained forever closed. Peter Morrison had paid the ultimate price to protect the world from the horrors his family had helped unleash, and in the shadow realm where he now dwelt, he would continue that protection for all eternity, ensuring that the living and the dead remained in their proper realms. Dr. Elena Vasquez stood before the Colorado State Historical Commission, presenting her final report on what the official records would call the Morrison Ranch Archaeological Survey. The sanitized version bore no resemblance to the supernatural horror she'd witnessed, but it served its purpose, ensuring the property would be designated as a protected historical site, preventing future development or excavation. The indigenous burial grounds discovered on the property show evidence of significant spiritual importance to local tribes, Eleanor told the commissioners, her voice steady despite the weight of her deceptions. "We recommend permanent preservation status to honor these sacred sites." What she didn't mention was the network of salt circles and blessed iron stakes she and Thomas had buried across the property. Every entrance to the homestead was now warded with protective symbols that would trigger violent supernatural reactions if anyone attempted to perform necromantic rituals on the land. Thomas Hartwell had recovered remarkably well from his decades of imprisonment. The publicity surrounding his rescue had made him something of a local celebrity, though the official story credited his survival to an elaborate kidnapping scheme rather than supernatural imprisonment. He'd used his newfound fame to establish the Hartwell Foundation, ostensibly dedicated to helping missing persons cases, but actually focused on identifying and neutralizing other sites where the Millbrook Circle might have operated. "We've documented 17 potential locations across 6 states, Thomas reported during one of their weekly meetings at a diner in Pueblo. 3 showed definite signs of recent activity. Whatever David accomplished before we stopped him, it activated dormant sites across the entire network." Elena reviewed the photographs Thomas had gathered. Several showed suburban houses where families had reported unusual phenomena, voices from empty rooms, shadows that moved independently of their sources, temperatures that fluctuated wildly without explanation. In each case, the Hartwell Foundation's investigators had found evidence of past necromantic activity dating back to the 1960s and early 1970s. The Brennan family in Ohio was the most concerning, Thomas continued. Their teenage daughter started speaking in voices that claimed to be deceased relatives. When our team investigated, we found original circle documentation hidden in their basement walls. What did you do? Performed a cleansing ritual based on your grandmother's notes. The voices stopped, but the girl has no memory of the past 3 months. Her parents think she had a severe bout of depression. Thomas stirred his coffee absently. Sometimes I wonder if ignorance isn't a blessing. Elena understood his sentiment. The knowledge of what lurked beyond the barrier between worlds was a burden that grew heavier with each passing day. She'd returned to her teaching position at the University of New Mexico, but her research had taken on new urgency. Every folklore account of spirit communication, every historical record of unexplained deaths, every indigenous warning about places where the dead walked among the living, all of it now carried potential significance. Her most promising lead had come from an unexpected source. Professor James Whitmore at Harvard University had contacted her after reading her published papers on indigenous burial practices. What started as academic correspondence had revealed that Whitmore's grandfather had been a priest in Massachusetts during the 1920s, where he'd encountered what his private journals described as an outbreak of the walking dead. The Whitmore documents describe events remarkably similar to what happened in Colorado, Elena told Thomas. Multiple resurrections, possessed individuals, even astronomical alignments that seem to trigger increased supernatural activity. You think there were other groups like the Millbrook Circle? I think the Circle wasn't the beginning of this phenomenon, just one chapter in a much longer story. The knowledge of how to breach the barrier between worlds is ancient, and it resurfaces periodically when the right conditions align. Thomas leaned back in his booth, suddenly looking every one of his 70-plus years. So what we stopped wasn't the end of the threat. It was just the latest manifestation of something that's been happening for centuries, maybe millennia. But Peter's sacrifice gave us something previous generations didn't have, a guardian on the other side. According to my grandmother's notes, someone with Morrison blood who willingly crossed into the shadow realm would become a permanent sentinel, able to detect and prevent future breaches. As if summoned by their conversation, Elena's specialized equipment began registering unusual electromagnetic fluctuations. The device she'd built, based on her grandmother's designs, was calibrated to detect supernatural activity. And the readings were spiking dramatically. "Something's happening," she said, checking the GPS coordinates on her tablet. "The disturbance is coming from the old Morrison homestead." They drove to the ranch in Thomas's pickup truck, arriving just as the sun was setting behind the western mountains. The property looked peaceful enough from the road, just empty grassland dotted with the ruins of old buildings. But Elena's instruments told a different story. The electromagnetic signature is identical to what we recorded during David's ritual, she said, studying the readings with a growing alarm. But it's not malevolent. It's protective. They walked through the cottonwood trees toward the old farmhouse, following the strengthening signal. As they approached the ruins, Elena noticed something that made her heart race with excitement and terror in equal measure. Fresh footprints in the mud around the foundation. Bootprints that looked exactly like the ones Peter Morrison had worn during their desperate flight across 4 states. "Thomas, look at this." The old man knelt beside the prints, his face pale in the fading light. "These are recent. Within the last few hours, Elena's equipment was practically screaming now, the readings off every scale she'd calibrated. But the energy signature was definitely protective, not threatening. Whatever was causing the disturbance was actively strengthening the barriers they'd established, rather than trying to breach them. As they approached the spot where the farmhouse's main room had been, Elena saw something that confirmed her wildest hopes. Carved into a piece of fallen timber were fresh symbols, the same protective wards her grandmother had used, but executed with a precision that spoke of intimate familiarity with their purpose. "He's still here," she whispered. "Peter's still protecting this place." Thomas touched the carved symbols with trembling fingers. "Can you communicate with him?" Elena pulled out a piece of equipment she'd never tested, a device based on theoretical work her grandmother had done about communication across dimensional barriers. The electromagnetic resonance patterns suggested it might be possible to establish contact with someone in the shadow realm, though the risks were enormous. I can try. But if this creates any kind of opening between worlds, even a small one, Peter would close it if it became dangerous, Thomas said with surprising confidence. He's proven he'll sacrifice anything to protect our world. Elena activated the communication device, adjusting frequencies until she found a resonance pattern that matched the protective energy surrounding the homestead. At first, there was only static, the electromagnetic noise that existed between dimensions. Then gradually a voice emerged from the interference. Elena, Thomas. The voice was unmistakably Peter's, though it carried harmonics that spoke of vast distances and otherworldly experiences. I'm glad. You're both safe. Peter! Elena fought back tears of relief and joy. Are you all right? What's it like on the other side? Difficult to explain. In your terms, time doesn't work. The same way here. The shadow realm is not what I expected. Peter's voice faded in and out like a radio signal in a storm. The entities here aren't all malevolent. Many are just lost, confused. They were never meant to cross between worlds. What about David? Is he still a threat? David has been contained. There are others here, guardians like myself, who maintain the barriers. I'm not the first to make this sacrifice. The signal strengthened slightly. But I need to warn you, the astronomical alignments are cyclical. Every 30 years, the barriers weaken naturally. When that happens, others will try what the circle accomplished. Thomas leaned closer to the communication device. What can we do to prepare? Keep watching. Keep learning. The knowledge exists in fragments, scattered across different cultures. Indigenous peoples understood these dangers long before European settlers arrived. Their warnings were dismissed as superstition. Eleanor thought about the research she'd been conducting, the connections she'd been discovering between different folkloric traditions. Are you saying that indigenous shamans knew about the shadow realm? They knew about the boundary places, locations where the barrier is naturally thin. Many of the sites where circle members operated were already known to be dangerous. That's why traditional peoples avoided them. The implications hit Elena like a physical blow. The Millbrook Circle hadn't discovered some new form of dark magic. They'd stumbled onto ancient knowledge that indigenous peoples had spent centuries learning to respect and avoid. Peter, we've identified other sites where similar activities might have occurred. Can you sense them from where you are? Some of them, yes. There are disturbances in the barrier, old wounds that never healed properly. The site in Massachusetts that your professor colleague mentioned, that one is particularly dangerous. Elena made notes, frantically as Peter described the locations. He could sense from the shadow realm. The pattern that emerged was chilling, a network of weak points in the dimensional barrier scattered across North America, many of them corresponding to sites where indigenous peoples had reported supernatural phenomena for generations. We need to map all of these locations, Elena said. Create a monitoring system that can detect if anyone tries to exploit the weak points. Good. But remember, the greatest danger comes during the conjunction years. 2055 will be the next major alignment, stronger than anything. In the past century, the communication signal began to weaken as whatever energy allowed it started to fade. Peter's voice became increasingly distant, though his urgency remained clear. Elena, Thomas, you must find others. People who understand what we're fighting. The knowledge can't be allowed to die with you. Train successors. Establish networks. Prepare for what's coming. Peter, wait! Elena adjusted her equipment desperately, trying to maintain the connection. One more thing. The ranch will always be protected. I can sense when someone approaches with harmful intent. The land itself will resist them, but other sites need guardians in your world. People who can recognize the signs and act quickly. The signal dissolved into static, then silence. Elena tried repeatedly to re-establish contact, but whatever window had allowed communication between dimensions had closed. The electromagnetic readings returned to normal, leaving only the carved protective symbols as evidence of Peter's presence. Thomas stood slowly, his joints protesting after kneeling beside the communication device. 33 years until the next major alignment. That gives us time to prepare, if we use it wisely. Elena began packing her equipment, her mind already racing with plans. We need to contact Professor Whitmore immediately, and we should reach out to indigenous communities whose ancestors might have knowledge about these boundary places. As they walked back through the cottonwood trees toward their truck, Elena felt a profound sense of purpose settling over her. Peter's sacrifice had given them more than just a sealed doorway. It had provided them with a guardian who could warn them of future threats and guide their preparations. For the battles to come, the Morrison ranch stood empty in the gathering darkness. But it was no longer a place of horror. It had become a fortress, protected by someone who had chosen to stand eternal watch in the space between worlds. And somewhere in that impossible realm beyond death, Peter Morrison continued his family's long journey toward redemption, ensuring that the sins of previous generations would never again threaten the innocent. The war between the worlds of the living and the dead was far from over. But for the first time in generations, the living had a guardian on the other side, and the knowledge necessary to face whatever emerged from the shadows. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.